Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all our guests, and especially our invited speakers to today's webinar. Our guests join us from all over the world, and our speakers today are from India, Brazil, the UK, and Belgium. My name is Joanna Buerta, and I'm the moderator of today's event. I am the HOD of Public Law in the Faculty of Law, Nelson Mandela University in Port Elizabeth, South Africa. You were meant to attend a conference with us in September 2020. Together with the Law and Development Research Network, the LDRN, the faculty is the co-host of today's webinar, which addresses the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on law and development research agendas. As many of you know, the LDRN aims to enhance knowledge and understanding of the role of law in relation to development and governance, both in the domestic and international spheres. The LDRN is thus concerned with the social functioning of legal systems, primarily in the context of countries in the Global South. Our website gives more information, and we welcome new members on an ongoing basis. One of the LDR aims is for our community to engage in fruitful and critical discussion on the role of law in development. The 2020 conference, as I've said a moment ago, was postponed to 2021 as a consequence of the pandemic. And it is thus fitting that we engage today by addressing the impact of the pandemic on our research agendas. We aim to focus on 4 cross-cutting themes for law and development in the time of COVID. The 4 themes are public health, addressed by Dr. Rachel Hammonds, one of our guest speakers, climate change, Dr. Stelina Jolly, sovereign debt, Dr. Celine Tan, and poverty, Professor Monica Sopocaya Machado. Before I introduce the first speaker, Dr. Rachel Hammonds, a few housekeeping rules. The format will be 4 short interventions by each of our thematic experts, whom I shall introduce to you individually before each speaker commences speaking. Each speaker will address us for approximately 7 to 10 minutes. You've joined us muted and with your cameras off, but you have access to the Q&A discussion throughout the webinar on your toolbar, the question mark icon. During the formal part of the program, and indeed thereafter, please feel free to post specific questions or comments in the Q&A chat bar. You can either address those to a specific speaker or more generally if you prefer. We ask that these questions and comments be respectful, be posted with a full appreciation of the essence of academic integrity. Ms. Deborah Castellan of the University of Antwerp and the editor-in-chief of the LDRN and I will be collating the questions to pose these to the speakers after Monica has completed her presentation. We welcome Deborah most heartedly to the NMU, again, because she's an alumni of our university and also an RA in Public Law, a research associate. So with that said, we look forward to engaging with you as a network today. We hope to do so constructively and in a manner which involves everyone. And I shall begin by introducing our first speaker, Dr. Rachel Hammonds. So Dr. Hammond is a licensed New York State attorney with a doctorate in medical sciences. Her work focuses on the intersection of global health governance and human rights. Rachel Hammond's teaching and research experience includes time at the Harvard School of Public Health, FXB. I was told not to say that in full because it's quite difficult. It's the FXB, Center for Health and Human Rights, the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and the University of Antwerp. I mentioned that the University of Antwerp is the founding partner of the LDRN, together with a number of other universities. She has been named among 300 women leaders in global health by the Graduate Institute in Geneva. Rachel, we look forward to your presentation, and I now hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Joanna, and welcome everybody, wherever you're joining us from. I'm joining you from Belgium, where I have been for the past 8 months because of the COVID-19 crisis and many of the limitations on travel, which have led to us not having our live in-person event this year, our conference, and I'm really honored to be invited to participate in these different sessions that are going to be hosted over the coming months. So those of you who I've met at past LDRN conferences know that my focus is very much on health, health governance, and in particular global health governance. So I'm going to start my presentation with a couple of definitions for those of you who are not familiar with my subject area. So I'm going to start with global governance and the way that I understand it for global health, and then global health itself. So global governance is essentially governing without sovereign authority, relationships that transcend national frontiers, and global governance is doing internationally what governments do at home. So those of us who focus on global health view it as an area for study, research, and practice that places a priority on improving health and achieving equity in health for all people worldwide. So as a law and development scholar, when I look at global health governance, I look at it with an equity lens. And as a result, the COVID-19 pandemic has had a huge impact on my research agenda, coinciding with themes that have appeared throughout my research career and being really augmented by the increase, the magnification of issues of equity and fairness that the COVID-19 pandemic has revealed. So if I turn to these themes of equity and fairness, the first that I'd like to highlight as an area for ongoing research relates to vaccine nationalism and global access to vaccines. I've already engaged in extensive work on TRIPS and patents, and those of you in South Africa are no doubt very familiar with the work in your country, as in Brazil, on getting access to medicines, in particular with the struggle for access to antiretrovirals that took place in the early 2000s. The other issues related to equity and fairness, where I see COVID-19 particularly impacting, are on all of the SDG goals that my colleagues will be speaking to in the upcoming presentations. And finally, this concept of One Health, health and climate change, and antimicrobial resistance, huge themes in global health that have been impacted by COVID-19 and will need to be accounted for in the upcoming research that I and others who work on global health issues will be focusing on. The second area that I spend a lot of my time working on is multilateralism and global health governance. So as you're no doubt aware, with the last 4 years of the Trump presidency, we've had a big push to try and undermine multilateral cooperation. We've had Trump and the US intending to pull out of the World Health Organization and essentially using COVID as a grounds for doing this, but it was part of a wider theme. And for those people who are committed to multilateral cooperation, as I would say I am, it's a real relief to have a different perspective coming from the United States. So one other element of this that we see is the weakness of WHO in the way in which it has been able to respond to the COVID-19 crisis. We see the politicization of public health and global health. Again, we see this very strongly in the United States and Brazil, And we also see the global health security agenda rising up on the priority list. So for those of us who work in global health, two overarching paradigms that I work on, the right to health and the global health security paradigm, both again, international law, International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights for the right to health, the international health regulations, which are certain to be reviewed post-COVID, and then again, the scope, understanding where we move forwards with these particular ideas. And again, I put at the bottom the SDG goal of ensure healthy lives and promote well-being for all at all ages, which is what is supposed to be framing most cooperation in global health. If I turn briefly to the SDGs, this objective of achieving universal health coverage, so financial risk protection, access to quality, essential healthcare services, and access to safe, effective, quality, and affordable essential medicines and vaccines for all is another area that is being rethought in light of access to COVID medications, both therapeutics and vaccines. When we read that the UK is the first country to begin a mass immunization program of well-trialed, tested, and authorized vaccine yesterday, we see that it's going to be taking at least 2 years to bring these vaccines to people in low and middle income countries, because wealthy countries, and in particular, I would highlight the role of Canada, which has purchased 4 times or has advanced commitments to 4 times the number of vaccines that it actually needs, thereby preventing other countries from being able to access essential medicines and vaccines for all. And finally, when I come to global health governance, I mentioned before, I'm going to be looking at the state at which the WHO emerges from this crisis and the role of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in moving forwards on its agenda. Looking also at the role of the Global Fund, which has been an excellent coordinator of treatments for the 3 big diseases, communicable diseases, HIV, AIDS, TB, and malaria. And I'm going to be looking at all of these other organizations that are engaged in global health governance. So a busy agenda for those of us who work on public health nationally or on global health, and COVID has made it even more relevant. So with that brief introduction, I'm going to turn back to Joanna and say thank you very much for the opportunity to present, and I look forward to your questions. Back to you, Joanna.
Thank you very much, Rachel, for that insightful presentation. I mentioned as well that all the presentations will be available on the LDRN website and also on the Faculty of Law website, should you wish to access those. Also, before I introduce Stelina, please feel free to post comments and questions in the Q&A bar so that we can engage with the speakers after all 4 presentations. I move now to introduce Dr. Stelina Jolly, who is a Senior Assistant Professor at the Faculty of Legal Studies, South Asian University, an international organization established by the Regional Group of the South Asian Nations. She is also a visiting Senior Research Associate with the Center for Emerging Countries in Private International Law at a fellow South African university, the University of Johannesburg, with which we do quite a bit of work. She's also a Fulbright Scholar with the University of San Francisco and a recipient of the International Visitors Leadership Program. Stelina researches international environmental law and conflict of laws. She is a member of the IUCN World Commission on Environmental Law and has recently co-authored a book entitled Climate Refugees in South Asia, Protection under International Legal Standards and State Practices in South Asia. Apologies, Stelina. She's also edited a collection entitled Private International Law, South Asian States Practice. Both books were published by Springer. Stelina is an exceptionally busy person, but she undertakes projects and consultancies with various organizations, including the Rajiv Gandhi Foundation, the EU, IRENA, amongst others. And her extensive CV will be made available as well on our website. So Stelina, on this note, who better to speak on the issue of climate change in the time of COVID-19? I hand over to you.
Thank you, Johanna, and thank you, Rachel, for setting the stage. First of all, let me express my sincere gratitude to LDRN network for providing me this opportunity to express my thoughts on COVID-19 and climate change. So in the next 10 minutes or so, I'll just try to highlight some of the change research agenda with regard to climate change as a result of COVID-19 crisis. I'm just trying to share my screen. I hope it is visible to you. So with regard to the COVID-19, the Rachel has highlighted that this particular issue has wreaked havoc in individuals and the jurisdictions. It has affected the humanities and the communities in a different manner. So a question with regard to the researchers, but the researching in the climate change has come, has arisen is that what is exactly the impact of COVID-19 on the climate change research agenda? And a direct analysis actually reveals that there may not be very, very clear-cut correlation between climate change and COVID-19, though definitely the studies has highlighted that the climate change coupled with perhaps the air pollution can be a factor in terms of spreading and transmitting a climate change. But what could be very, very discernible in terms of climate change and COVID is that, especially as a response to the COVID-19 crisis, most of the countries across the world adopted a lockdown policy. That seems to be having a very, very clear and immediate impact of reducing the greenhouse gas emissions. So one of the first legal research agenda, or even in terms of policy challenge, will be for the world community and the jurisdiction to see that whatever the reductions which has happened as a result of the lockdown, how that can be actually maintained. I'll just give you an example of a Maldives, which is can be considered to be a symbol of climate change. Maldives, for their electricity generation, heavily relies on the diesel oil. And for the revenue for that diesel obviously comes from the tourism. But as a result of COVID, there has been a severe impact of the tourism in Maldives, and Maldives was struggling to find or support the subsidies. So this I will, for the countries like Maldives, you can have the similar example from other jurisdiction as a lesson or as an opportunity to see that, okay, they can maybe adopt or shift to another climate friendly technologies, etc. So the legal and policy measures has to be changed to see that whatever the reduction of the greenhouse emissions that has happened as a result of the lockdown is maintained, or some kind of an effort has to be done. So with this first, the point, let me move to the core issue of climate change and the COVID-19 crisis. If you take the COVID-19, definitely it was a public global pandemic and a health crisis. Even though there may not be a very, very direct relationship between COVID and the climate change, but both both kind of a crisis exhibits many similarities in terms of its perhaps magnitude and also in terms of its local and global impact, and also both act as a multiplier effect. So with this background, there is a lot for climate change research, even in terms of policy and legal research to learn. Two aspects I would like to highlight. One, in terms of preparedness. See, if you take the COVID crisis is not the only pandemic the world has actually faced in its history. But when the COVID actually struck, the world community's preparedness with regard to tackling a pandemic was heavily exposed. So similar will be the scenario with regard to the climate change. So one of the legal focus and policy focus has to be on preparedness. So here again, I would like to highlight two aspects. See, there is a very, very strong risk perception attached to it. See, if you take the COVID, when the world community came to know in Wuhan, it originated in 2019. The world community did not pay much of an attention to it because what happens is that with regard to health or a climate change crisis, unless and until that hits you, the people or society is not ready to believe that this is actually happening. So that is where the requirement of climate change education and communication, I think there has to be much more emphasized with regard to the policy and legal affairs, the matters with regard to climate communication has to be given, because this is all the more is important is that even the COVID crisis has actually shown that how the dissemination of information and the communication and also a kind of a participatory democracy that actually has tilted how some jurisdiction has been able to better manage the COVID crisis. So similar scenario will apply in terms of climate change. Also, I think one of the area as a policy and legal research has to focus is on the how to better communicate the climate crisis. This is. So this preparedness should not be in terms of actually having a set of legislation. If you take the climate change, many countries in the world do not have a legislation, but even passing a legislation that may not be actually enough. What will be the challenge is to see that how we can actually mainstream the climate change into the governance agenda. I'll just give you an example. For instance, if we take the environmental impact assessment, that's one of the major procedural tool with regard to environmental governance and decision making. But most of the environmental the impact assessment tools across the jurisdiction do not integrate the climate change as a concern. So my point is that I think one of the challenge for the international environmental law itself will be to see that climate change is introduced as an integral part of the entire governance agenda. And again, like, when we talk of preparedness, adaptation has to go hand in hand. So again, when we talk of adaptation, I think the legal researchers has to focus on what could be the mechanism. I'll go back to the principle 10 of Rio Declaration, which is highlighting the procedural aspect of environmental rights of participation and decentralization information. I think how these mechanisms can be maintained, more of a decentralized administration or a participatory, I think that has to be the focus. So with this background, the challenge for the researchers will be not to address the climate change only from a global perspective, but to approach a comparative approach that you can see the best practices across the jurisdiction, and also to emphasize on a empirical socio-legal research to highlight the lived experiences. So I think a bottom-up approach will be the need of the hour with regard to the climate change research. Now moving towards COVID has exposed the fault lines in society, whether it is with regard to economical classification, poverty, age, gender, or racial. The climate change is also supposed to be having a disproportionate impact, and the evidence has been very, very clear. So with regard to the global climate change and equity, till now the focus has been on CBDR principles, but now under the Paris that has been diluted. So the entire COVID crisis has exposed the need to focus much more on the equity aspect of climate change. So it's for the legal community to decide that whether that equity has to be through the climate justice perspective, or it has to be a rewinding of the CBDR principle, or the social component of sustainable development, can that ensure? But whatever may be the focus, I think the emphasis has to be on ensuring human rights and public participation through a empirical socio-legal research focusing on the lived experiences. Further moving towards, again, Rachel has talked about the global health and security narratives. So the climate change is also considered to be a security issue. So as we have seen that, okay, as a response to the COVID crisis, many nations has adopted measures which is in sometimes even violative of the individual civil liberties and a kind of an authoritarianism where there is less place for political dissent or a dialogue. So that one of the legal challenge should be to see that how the climate possibility of authoritarianism can be negated, or where a climate decisions can be made with a spirit of democratic approaches. So this also has to be one of the focus on the climate change research agenda. Further, rightly Rachel has pointed out the multilateralism and institutional aspects. The COVID crisis had exposed the inability of WHO to address the issues, and mainly many reasons has been attributed. One is the the institutional the institutional structure itself, and also the soft law nature of the WHO, whether if we can call it as a health, if the international health law. So I think even with regard to climate change also, focusing on the institutional reforms and strengthening, because at the global level, we do not have a kind of an institutional structure managing the international environmental governance. And also in this, the North-South paradigm, because like the vaccine, the nationalism. So even with regard to the climate change, the fault lines of the global North and South, I think that is ever issues that is still relevant even in the post-19 scenario also will be. I'll just try to wind up by highlighting just two more issues. As a result of COVID, we have seen that there is a lot of use of plastics in terms of the mask, in terms of the medical equipments, and also the PPE kit. So I think one of the challenge also will be to see that how this can be effectively disposed of. The legal and policy measures has to immediately turn their attention towards it. The last two aspect which I would like to focus on is the climate disaster displacement.
Stelina, sorry to interrupt you, just to let you know that we're running out of time for you. So if you could perhaps wrap up, that would be great. Thank you very much.
So just 1 minute, I'll be wrapping up. So with regard to the COVID, with regard to the climate change, the displacement is a huge issue. So we have seen is that almost 1/3 of the internally displaced people are, most of them are located in countries which are at risk to COVID-19. So for those displaced people, this is a kind of a double jeopardy, like they have a health crisis and also a climate crisis. So one of the immediate challenge will be to see that because in these areas, whether it is a better hygiene or social distancing is not possible, and also because of the lockdown, many people are prevented from moving to a safer location which is facing the climate change. So some of the challenge, the legal focus has to be on the rights of the displaced population, and also to see that they have been, their rights are not violated and they are able to move to a safer locations where they are actually facing climate change. So yeah, thank you. Thank you. I now hand over to Johanna. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Stelina, and thank you very much for drawing connections as well between the various research themes that we have, and hopefully opening up the floor for some discussion in relation to future research agendas and how as a network we can cooperate with one another. Issues relating to internally displaced persons' health, and no doubt our next two speakers will also weigh in on these issues. So allow me then to introduce the third speaker, Monica Sapukaya Makadu, who is an attorney in Brazil with a doctorate in political science and economic law. Her work focuses on gender issues relating to income, equal opportunities, public policy, and the glass ceiling phenomenon. Monica is a professor of various master programs at the Brazilian Learning Institute of Development and Research. She leads the research group Women and Democracy, which comprises 3 universities in Brazil. Monica is the author of the book Women's Right, Higher Education, Labor and Autonomy, published by Almadina. She is also the coordinator and organizer of the Women's Rights book series collection, which is published by Deviant. So Monica will now address us, but I do remind you Thank you, Devanshi. We've seen your question, but we do remind you to pose questions for the speakers so that we can start engaging after the presentations. I'm now going to hand over to Monica in Brazil.
Good afternoon or good morning, everyone. I'm Monica Sapucaia Machado. I'm a law professor here in Brazil. My research fields are equal opportunity for women and democracy. And I would like to say that I'm thrilled to participate in this webinar, especially with women so important in the academic legal area. So thank you so much for inviting me. It's an honor. As I am the only one that English is not my original language, I will try to read my presentation slowly so everyone can understand me. I hope that I can do this. So I'm gonna show some slides, just a minute. Let's see, okay. Sorry, it's in the beginning. Let's, okay. As December of 2020, more than 1.5 million people had officially died of COVID-19 in the world. In absolute numbers, United States, India, and Brazil are the countries where most people died and still dying. They are also the only countries with more than 100,000 deaths. And we don't know how many going to be until the end of this crisis. So these three countries have some common characteristics. They have continental dimensions, a large population, and an equal society. And that's something that I've been working a lot in this past years. USA has one of the worst inequality rates among rich countries, despite being the world's wealthiest. Over 40 million Americans live below the poverty line, and health is not a fundamental right. It's something that nobody can understand. According with 2018 census, the American 2018 census, 27 million Americans have no health care at all, and 6 million have a weak one, which barely guarantees primary care. So the situation is not really easy. India has a strictly unequal society with more than 6 million people in extreme poverty. Government spending on health policies rates among the lowest in the world. 10% of the population holds 77% of the country's wealth. And the country is in the 129th position among 189 in the Human Development Index. And Brazil, the least populous of the three countries that I'm talking about today, and in my country, the one that I know a little bit more, is one of the most unequal countries in the world. We have a population of 211 million people, and we are the 7th most unequal country globally, and the first among countries with more than 100 million people. And the only country outside Africa, the 10 most unequal nations in the world. The island of St. Lucia in Caribbean is also on the line, and in this, however, it's only 180,000 residents, so it's not really relevant. Healthcare in Brazil is a fundamental right, but unfortunately, the government offers free and universal health to all, but unfortunately, since the 2016, the government funding are more limited, and we haven't, since the President Dilma impeachment, problems with the budget. The health system has been suffering constant cuts from the federal administration. It's something that is a problem for us. But my subject normally is about gender and gender issues, inequality. And regarding gender inequality, according to the UN, no country in the world will be able to reach the 2030 commitment to sustainable development. And that's really a sad information for all of us. It will take more than a decade for equality to be a reality anywhere in the world. So I think the pandemic probably will aggravate and will change our research about it. Women represent the poorest and the most vulnerable social group. 330 million women and girls live with less than $1.9 a day. Is 4.4 more than men. In nearly 2/3 of the countries, women are more likely than men to report food insecurity. Women do 2.5 more unpaid care and domestic work than men. And now in pandemic, this is aggravating. With advent of the COVID-19 pandemic, the reality of women and girls has worsened substantially. COVID has no cure and can be fatal. The only effective action is social distance, so the contamination does not spread. So the house, historically female stronghold, has become the environment for confinement, and at the same time a space for work and study at distance, and a family place that was not so crowded before pandemic. Women began to have to manage their kids' education. We still haven't begun classes in Brazil, almost a year without classes for kids, and remote control and the increase of domestic chores, while experience the decrease of purchasing power, and in many homes an escalation of domestic violence. I saw a question about this. We don't know exactly, we don't have the data, but we know that situation with domestic violence is increasing. According to United Nations, 48 million women will be thrown into poverty in 2021 due to the pandemic. It's important to say that data is not still very little disaggregated. Only 37% of confirmed cases were classified under age and sex. So this probably is going to be a problem for us. Evidence indicates that COVID-19 deepened gender inequality and pushes women into poverty more than men, and importantly more than men, but this data is not yet conclusive because we are not making the effort to save this data now. After vaccination, we will have to study the information provided by the countries. And I believe that the lack of structure to protect and empower women will likely be seen in women's situation after COVID-19. Rachel probably know more than me about that, but women represent 70% of the workers in health services worldwide, 80% of nurse and nursing assistant. And we are seeing that women are 3 times more contaminated than men when working with health. And only the most relevant factors for analyzing post-pandemic women living conditions will be the labor market, I believe. Women tend to have less secure jobs and have fewer rights. Sectors such as hotel, food chain, retail were significantly affected by the quarantine, and these are the sectors which women are most employed. So the research in the labor market will have to change their methodology probably to understand the situation. Domestic work is another sector that was drastically reduced during the confinement and imposed great economic insecurity on vulnerable women. Normally, these women already are vulnerable, is informal work. And medical workers. Finally, it's worth to remember that women represent 7% in the health service worldwide, and as nurses, I already said this. So just so we know, we probably will have more women in the exposed to contamination and consequently complication due to highly exposed to varied load, because they are in a what we call essential work, and they're not stopping, they're not quarantining. But understand that the reality of women in the pandemic is not the same between countries and international organizations. Rachel already said something about that. Due to the lack of data, the World Health Organization is not giving us, not providing age and sex of those infected and dead. So it's hard to know exactly how this is playing. On July, only 11% of the budget spent in producing data on COVID-19 was gender programs or gender. Notwithstanding, economic data indicated 11 million more women than men will live on less than $1.9 a day in 2021, and so women will be more in poverty. Also, the feminized business sectors are 19% more likely to collapse than the essentially male ones, because women work in the chains that are less have less importance. The contamination of women's healthcare are 3 times greater than the men in the same sectors. And that's what we think we're gonna find after COVID. I think that I would like to show you that social protective measures in June, 195 countries had some emergency economic aid system. I don't know if they have more now, but that was a big number. None of these countries created a policy only for women, but 9 designed programs for those who care for children, and normally are women. So that's something that we're probably gonna look after the pandemic, but it's something interesting to see. The USA aid concerning the universal income transfer amount $1,200 did not specify women's. Parents with children away from school had 12 weeks of family leave, provided they were employed at the time. India has a program for women, and India Guarantee Women who belong to the inclusive program. I'm not going to try to read the number, the name, I'm sorry, but it's PMGDY, $6.5 per month, which includes 200 million women. So,
Monica, just to let you know that we...
Okay. And in Brazil, we have a program of $90 a month, but single mothers with that doesn't live with a partner or a husband, they are receiving $180 a month. That's the other thing that we're gonna look forward to understand. Before the pandemic, my research fields, I was studying about lawyers, because Brazil has 1 million lawyers. No, I'm not saying wrong. It's 1 million lawyers, and half of this are women. And Brazil has more law school than all the countries in the world combined. But now being a lawyer is not really a good idea. You probably won't make good money. So that's what I would studying before the pandemic, and I think probably I'm gonna have to revisit my numbers because things probably are changing right now. So thank you so much. This is my information, and I'm gonna give back to Joanna. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Monica. I think there's a bit of an echo there. There we go. Yeah, Monica raising some very interesting issues there in relation to the SDGs and the SDG numbers. I see we have a question on the SDGs still being relevant, which we'll address just now. And certainly the issue of vulnerability as well, speaking to many of the law and development research themes, which were also addressed in some of our previous conferences. It's now my pleasure to introduce our last speaker, Dr. Celine Tan, who is no stranger to the LDRN network. Celine is a reader in law at the School of Law, the University of Warwick. Her research centers on exploring aspects of international economic law and regulation, with a focus on international development financing law, policy, and governance. Celine is also co-director of the Center for Law, Regulation and Governance of the Global Economy, or GLOBE, and a fellow of the Institute for Global Sustainable Development, IGSD at Warwick, as well as a founding member, lots of acronyms here, Celine, of the IEL Collective, a platform and network aimed at pluralizing and diversifying scholarship and practice in international economic law. And as someone who is not too clued up on international economic law, I really look forward to your presentation. Celine, over to you.
Thank you very much, Joanna, and it's a privilege and a pleasure to be addressing all of you here today. It's a shame that we're not really in South Africa, which was the original plan, that we could meet each other there. But I guess one of the, I suppose, the silver lining in the whole COVID pandemic is to move to these kinds of platform, which enables greater participation from everybody, and to hear a greater plurality of voices. So I've been given the hard task to follow on from three excellent speakers on the implications of COVID-19, the pandemic for law and development research agendas, and to speak particularly on one of the areas of my research, which is on sovereign debt. And I'd just like to bring in two really good points that Rachel, our first speaker, brought on about, really what drives the kind of architecture of research in the coming kind of, current pandemic, post-pandemic research agendas, which is, and I'd like to follow up on those two, which is on equity and fairness and on multilateralism. And I think those two kind of areas really speak to the arenas of sovereign debt. I mean, the COVID-19 crisis has really moved on from a health crisis to an economic crisis and a debt crisis. Many countries were on the verge of a debt crisis, so they went into the pandemic with quite unsustainable debt burdens. And what the pandemic has done is really just amplified this and make them much more unsustainable, much more acute. I mean, if you look at the statistics, it's quite worrying. You had large outflows of financial flows from emerging markets in March. It's now recovered. That's not necessarily a good thing in that sense, because there is a tendency for a huge, large accumulation of debt, what the Institute for International Finance called a coming debt tsunami. Into 2020 itself, we saw 6 developing countries, most recently Zambia, defaulting on their debt repayments, and this is compared to 3 debt defaults in the whole of the global financial crisis of 2008-2009. So we're looking at a very serious agenda here, issue here, and the impact on development is clearly going to be quite significant. Right, I think our previous speakers have talked about this in various areas in relation to their areas of research. I mean, there's going to be clearly less money out there for interventions in public health. for the mitigation and intervention in the health crisis, but also the climate crisis, and on poverty reduction and social welfare. And there's going to be much less out there in terms of a future post-pandemic recovery and investment. And I think that's what's worrying, because what we have as situation here is asymmetries within the global financial and economic architecture that's led to certain structural deficiencies in terms of resources for many countries, but certainly in developing countries, these are much more acute, and that has amplified, and in many ways amplified inequalities and hampered responses to the pandemic. And what I think the pandemic does is it's trying to spotlight on really the intersections of the development agenda with the structure of global finance. And I think this is a really crucial aspect that we need to kind of think about, and as researchers talk about and discuss and look at that. How is this? Well, I see it three different ways in which there's this intersection. Firstly, there is an outsized role of finance and public commercial finance, financial actors in the development trajectories, social development trajectories and economic trajectories of developing countries. The terms of finance, the conditionalities of finance, the structures of finance, the financial arrangements that developing country governments enter into with official creditors or commercial creditors really determine how effective governments are in terms of meeting social economic needs of their citizens and their communities, but also in terms of planning for investments to deal with natural disasters, to deal with humanitarian crisis, to deal with the climate crisis, and certainly to deal with health crisis. So that's really, I think, what we've seen is an outsized role of finance in the terms of financing that has a significant impact on policy choices of governments in developing countries. So that's really one thing. The second issue with relation to how COVID shines that spotlight, the intersections between finance and development agendas, is the significant asymmetries of the global economic order, and especially the deficits of the global financial system have been laid bare in terms of the way that the financial community is actually responding to this unsustainable debt burden. We are, 9 months on from, the pandemic and the declaration of a global pandemic, and we're seeing still recalcitrance on parts of creditor states, not just creditor states, but also private investors, multilateral creditors, in actually pursuing any form of sustainable debt restructuring mechanism for countries that are severely indebted. The debt service suspension initiative is really, it is a little bit of a band-aid, but it's not going to stem the tide of the debt repayments that are to come. And the recent G20 deal is problematic, and I can refer you on to different resources. We don't have time to go into it in specifically, but lots of people have done a lot of great work on debunking and sort of deconstructing that problematic initiative. It's something, but it's not everything. The third concern, and how COVID has thrown a spotlight on sort of like the intersections between finance and development, is that the pandemic has amplified existing asymmetries. And this is something that the previous speakers have mentioned. These inequalities are not new, but what the pandemic has done is just really magnified the effects of it. So the capacity of communities and countries to respond to the crisis really is rooted in the legacy of asymmetrical relationships that countries have had and communities have had with the global economic and financial order. And I think that is what is crucial in terms of, I suppose, determining what goes forward and what the impact of our research agendas are going to be. And that really, before I go on to looking at the kind of substantive research agenda, there are pragmatic impacts of how COVID is going to affect our research, right? And how debt burdens in countries, austerity measures are beginning to bite in all our institutions and all our sectors of higher education and in academia in general. It's going to bite into our budgets, right? it's going to, there's certainly less money for everything, and certainly less money for higher education. There's going to be less money for research. There's going to be less money in terms of cooperation between the North and the South in terms of partnerships. There's going to be, a lot of that, money is going to go, and what that means for our research agenda is something that we need to deal with. I don't have answers. I think that's something that we need to have a conversation about. It's certainly going to, the research is going to be driven by it's always been driven by donor interests. It's always been driven by, certain, I suppose, outsized financial interests and economic interests of certain states and donors. I think this is going to be amplified. If you look at the diversion of a lot of research, there are concerns about that a lot of scientific research, but also social scientific research, are being diverted to addressing COVID-specific issues. While this is, admirable, as we saw with the, the massive investment into vaccines, etc., there are going to be knock-on effects, because other diseases and other socioeconomic problems are not just going to go away because COVID is here, or they're, in the background, as Stelina said about climate. And so I think this also impacts on the plurality of research, because these asymmetries are there, and the countries and the communities and the researchers in more debt-strapped countries are going to be affected much more than those that have the resources to carry on. So the kind of research that is coming out, which is much needed from communities that are impoverished, is going to be much less out there, because academics and researchers in those countries are going to be laid off, have excessive workloads, not being able to conduct the research in the way that will feed into policy. So there is these problems, and there's the intersecting problems of where, our substantive, research agenda actually comes into kind of conflict with the actual operational issues and the very reality of indebtedness and so in the global economy. So in that sense,
Lena, I'm going to ask you to just wrap up there. You knew I was coming in.
You are going to wrap up. I'm going to make 3 interventions, if that's okay. So the focus, I think, in terms of research, going back to what Rachel has mentioned, the focus on equity and fairness, and the focus on multilateralism. How do we go forward, and how do we address these the issues? I think, first of all, we need to understand this role of finance and debt in our research agenda, both in an operational sense and a substantive kind of thematic sense, to integrate that, to understand how it affects all of us as researchers. We need to have much more conversations about the challenges of the normative role of finance and the financial economy, moving away from a conversation about like how much money we can get from donors, into a real conversation about the notion of debt and finance in the global economy. The concept of redistribution is really important. We don't talk about that. We don't talk about finance as a distributive global mechanism. We talk about aid, but aid is a really problematic concept. We need to talk about public finance. We need to talk about how public finance can alleviate the structural asymmetries that is a result of the inequality in the structures of global economic order. And we need to look into the plurality of research. As researchers, we need to understand, we need to support, we need to give money, we need to give resources, we need to have a genuine conversation about from those voices that have been marginalized, so that we can actually amplify. And as law and development researchers, I think that that's something that we should do. As a matter of course. Thank you very much, and our apologies for going over.
Yes, thank you, Celine. Well, I think it was great to have you at the end of the 3 presentations to be able to wrap up how we deal with this from an economic financing perspective, and so to put those problems into real perspective, into the money terms, the financing, and the like. So thank you very much for your presentation. We've received quite a few questions. I'm going to start right at the top with Devanchi's question, which was posed to Rachel, but I think that it would be interesting if Monica could also come in on this after Rachel, and that is that the World Health Organization notes the situation of already vulnerable populations, victims of interpartner violence, for example, and persons who need mental health counseling, escalates in conflict situations. This has definitely happened during the current pandemic, as many of you have highlighted. There was also an inconsistency globally in how essential services are defined. How does this topic feature in global health governance? And if Monica could come in after you, Rachel, on the issue of already vulnerable populations. Thank you. Over to Rachel.
Thank you, Joanna, and thank you, Devanshi, for that very good question that really highlights how COVID-19 has magnified problems that already existed. So the first thing that I'd like to turn to is the last part of your question. How does this issue of essential services feature in global health governance? As I mentioned during my presentation, the SDGs push national governments to move forwards on the provision of universal health coverage, so access to the health services that everybody needs. And as you noted, there's an inconsistency globally as to what these essential services comprise, which is why there is debate within the global health community as to what paradigm you use for framing your definition of global health and the objectives of global health. If global health is supposed to be trying to reduce equity, do you then adopt a human rights approach, which then applies a universal lens, which means that you shouldn't have this massive differentiation between what is considered essential services globally? Of course, as Celine highlighted, we're always going to have problems with resource constraints. But if we are working towards a minimum essential package of health services that include access to mental health services, the neglected part of the right to health. So the right to health is access to physical and mental health. The highest attainable standard of health is physical and mental health, and we often focus on physical and completely ignore the mental health part of this definition. So if global health governance is grounded, if universal health coverage is grounded in a right to health, we look at a very different understanding of what governments should be moving forwards to and the way in which they should work as well. Because as soon as you start working from a rights-based perspective, you include the vulnerable populations, those who are marginalized in the current system, in conversations about what should be in your health package. And you would also have included them during this current pandemic in what policies should be adopted. And for many women who live with violent partners, because let's face it, it is often women and children who are victims of gender-based violence. And men are also victims, but it is mainly women. And you would have included them or their representatives in conversations about what is going to happen if you're locked in your small flat with somebody for 6 weeks. These conversations were not had. So if we start from a perspective of rights, we would include those who are affected by the policies in this conversation about policy and also about what essential health services people would need. So I will leave it there and turn it over to Monica, who will give us, I think, a little bit more insight into the consequences that she has been tracking. Thank you. So over to Monica.
You already said most of what I was going to say. I think the pandemic showed us again that we live in a global situation. I think now in Brazil we have a discussion about if the Earth is global or if it's straight. So we're back to this conversation over here, but most of us know that it's global. But what I think, what I see is we still doing research with the neutral idea of a white male from the north. And I think even with all the effort of the international organization, we still think of humans as a white male from the north. And when we do politics and when we do public policies, international public policies, we forget something like what Rachel just said, that we're gonna put women and children with sometimes the aggressor, that we're gonna not send children to school. And here in Brazil, and I know that a lot of other countries, school was a place where they went to eat. They went to take a shower. They went to have a little bit of sun. And we just said, okay, let's everybody go to their homes. We can, you can be together. Okay, but we have places here in Brazil that 6, 7, 8 people lives in a very small flat or a very small house. And so with old and kids together, with old people and kids together, and their mother normally needs to work because he's supposed to be essential work, and they still working in the pandemic. So as a researcher, what I think that we need to try to change our idea of neutral, or idea of human when we write our research, when we write our methodology. We still having problem with this. So when we create policies, when we propose research, we forgot that not everybody is the same, and more that most are not white male and from the north. So I think that's something that we need to think about. Thank you.
Right, thank you to both. I think I'm going to go live. There we go. Thank you to both Rachel and Monica. Yeah, very interesting indeed. I'm going to move the discussion to climate change and then come back to issues of health and governance. But Ruby Ann has asked a question for you, Stelina. Ruby Ann, just to give some insight, is not in law, but she is the director of Gender Equality and Transformation at our university, so welcome. And she has asked, with climate change and the COVID pandemic having shown to impact negatively the impoverished and vulnerable populations, how do you think these effects can actually be addressed by domestic states through legislation and pragmatic measures? And then a similar question you'll see is the one from Anonymous. Sorry, I don't know who that is, saying that governments are taking some steps that governments are taking for rebuilding the economy post-COVID are actually contradicting the priorities mentioned. And there I see that the author has mentioned India's draft Environment Impact Assessment Notification 2020. So if you could speak to rebuilding the economy in relation to also climate change, and perhaps deal with those two questions, Stelina, thank you. Over to
you. Yeah. Thank you, Johanna, and thank you, Ruby. I think it's a very, very pertinent question that both COVID and the climate crisis has actually shown that the clear-cut fault lines in the society. So in this scenario, what exactly the international law, national legal policy framework is, what exactly can they do? In my view, there are a couple of steps which can be done. But as I said, none of the answers or none of the solutions will be a completely perfect. These are all in a process which we are trying to see that, okay, how the possibility of a disproportionate impact can be minimized or reduced. So the first is that to highlight the human rights apparatus. So if you look at that, okay, it's only very recently that the linkage between climate change and human rights has been researched. So with a specific to international law or any legal field, there is a particular tendency that whether it is a disaster management, whether it is a human rights, whether it is an investment, trade, climate change, they're all developed in a silo. So I think we really require a lot of synergy between the climate change and the human rights aspect. So national legislations and judiciary definitely can play a part in terms of ensuring, like Rachel has rightly pointed out with regard to SDG, the universal health coverage, that's definitely part of a human right. So the state's effort has to be there to see that universal health coverage has to be done. And also to see that not only in ensuring a formal right of human rights, but to see that there is an access to a whole lot of environmental rights, which goes on to make a dignified life, which includes a quality of access to air, water, sanitization, the food, health. So I think there has to be enough of steps which has to be taken. Yes, definitely resource crisis, resource crunch will be a problem, but I think more than the resource issues, but I think the willingness and a kind of an enabling ecosystem is definitely required. So if I take an example that, okay, in the context of India, like what of my research has actually shown that we have in the constitution right to life, and the judiciary has expanded the right. But what we see in terms of the cases with specifically my focus on environmental research, wherever a case regarding a drought prone management or a flood related, judiciary gives an overall view of sustainable development, or addressing the rights in a, gender neutral, or in other words, like, a generalistic development. But I think it is very high time we as a legal researchers and also the lawyers who is actually representing things, they have to highlight that, okay, the plurality of the issues from a gender point of view, issues from a particular class point of view, which I do not see that. So even the judicial verdict has to reflect that, rather than just saying that there is a right to water. So they have to highlight that there is a issue of gender issues involved in right to access to water. So I think there has to be a conscious accommodation, or you can say sensitivity on the part of legislatures and the judiciary in terms of looking at these issues from a multitude of social points. And for all these things to happen, I think there has to be an emphasis on, I will say, I think this is the core participatory democracy and access to, I think, information. I think that's the yardstick where there is a better participation and information sharing. I think the government has been able to respond in a much more better manner. Now, going to the second question with regard to the specific regard to how the governments after the lockdowns are responding, and that's in a way actually will take us right back to where we started with the with again going back to the greenhouse emissions going too high. Yes, you're right that, okay, if you take the draft environmental impact assessment policy of India, or the labor law policy of India, we are actually like, it shows that we have not actually learned the lessons. So as a legal researchers, what exactly the steps? I think there are a couple of steps which we can take. Yes, in terms of disseminating information, writing. This has actually been shown very, very clearly in the context of India. I will say just immediately after the draft impact assessment has been released, there has been a massive protest, whether it is from the academics, civil society, the movement. So I think there is a lot of power in that, the activist role, which I believe that I think all the researchers are in a way activists too. I think we need to highlight what exactly the fault or flaws with this legislative or policy measures, and we have to oppose and to show that through the advocacy or educations or information, and civil societies definitely can play a very, very major part. Media, if it is independent and transparent, can definitely play. Say all these things, agency has definitely to chip in, and that's what happened in the case of India. After a strong protest, the government had to help back. And also in the case of India, even the judiciary has been used beautifully. We saw a lot of, many multitude of public interest litigations filed against, and judiciary trying to highlight the need to for the communication and information, because India's draft EIA was published only in 2 languages, whereas we have multitude of language. So the judiciary said that unless and until you at least translate the EIA in different languages, you cannot go. So the judiciary has stepped in. So I think a lot of the government apparatus can be utilized effectively to highlight the opposition. And I'm sure, I think the global movements and history of resilience is anything to go by. I think we have multiple incidents, whether it is Vedanta, the groundwater struggles in many parts of the world. I think yes, the government can be held accountable to it. Thank you, Johanna.
Thank you.
Yeah,
thank you for for your very comprehensive replies. They're most appreciated. What I'm going to do is pose a question to Rachel from Morag. Good to see you present, Morag. And then from there, we'll move to the questions for Celine. So an interesting question from Morag, and that is, Rachel, to what extent do you expect post COVID and the lockdowns to have anticipated state investor litigation to shape the global health agenda moving forward? And given that it's state investor issues, from there we'll move to Celine, and there's a couple of questions that have been posed to you, Celine, in relation to the Argentinian experience. I'm just aware of the time. It's 4:15 in South Africa, so we'll take about another 5-10 minutes of questions, and then after that we'll wrap it up. So over to you, please, Rachel.
Thank you very much, and Morag, thank you for this fascinating question. And I think Celine will have a lot more to contribute on the state investor treaties than I will right now. I am aware that quite a few companies are exploring the possibility of suing states. For example, Italy may well be sued by several investors as a result of the lockdown measures that they have taken, which hampered economic growth and production, therefore leading to investors being unable to recoup the gains that they had hoped to get through profitable companies being able to trade. So if the economy is not functioning, companies are not trading, and they are not seeing return on their investments. And so the idea is that they will sue the state for these lost investments that relate to the lockdown measures that the state took. So global health has, to speak very generally, a rather difficult relationship with bilateral treaties that are often characterize these investor dispute mechanisms, that they often contain such things, because they seem to be superseding the state's sovereignty. And a lot of global health is founded on this concept of states having the sovereign right to make decisions for their populations in relation to health and to be prioritizing their health. And because these investor dispute mechanisms seem to create a parallel system of justice that give extra rights to corporations in global health, these are not so much seen to be as something that assists if you have concepts of equity or justice trying to be advanced through global health. If that is the purpose of the World Health Organization, namely to advance the right to health for all as is found in its constitution, these mechanisms have been highlighted many times as contributing to global health inequity. So for those who research on global health equity, this will be yet another area in which we see problems arising through the current economic model and system that Celine will speak about in just a second. But I also wanted to add, from a personal perspective, would certainly caution lawyers from pursuing many of these cases, because public trust in governments is something that is really being stretched right now. If we want to have a successful rollout of vaccines, we need to have public trust in governments. If we want to escape from COVID-19, we're going to need to be able to have herd immunity through a vaccine program. And if governments start to be, which are already going to be cash strapped as they struggle out of the financial hole that we've dug ourselves into during COVID, if corporations are seen to be attacking governments and trying to take the limited resources that they have, the debt that they're already in, and trying to take more money because they haven't been able to get the profits that they wanted, I see this as politically an unwise path to take. So I'm hoping that they will be able to come to perhaps decisions through arbitration rather than using the courts to do this. So I will hand over now to Celine, because I think she's going to have some interesting insights on how this whole economic model is in many ways distorting many of the objectives that we're hoping to see advanced in law and development research. Thank you.
Shall I answer, Joanna?
Yes, please. Thank you, Celine. If you could deal with that, and then also deal with some of the issues that have been raised in the Q&A in relation to what is happening in Argentina, questions from Mariana and also from Daniel in relation to tax, etc. It would be interesting, and then we'll have to wrap up after that. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. So over to you, Celine.
Thank you, Joanna. Yeah, I mean, on the issue of the investor-state arbitration, and with regards to certainly I don't really have much to expand on what Rachel said. Really, I think there is certainly a threat that may come from, you know, challenging government interference in sort of, you know, foreign investment in those cases, and certainly we will, well, I think I have a number of friends who are really good investment lawyers, and I strongly suggest that you you know, have a look at the IEL Collective website. We've got a blog that goes, and we've got a very good blog where my investment lawyer colleagues have detailed the implications of COVID-19 on investor-state arbitration and potential cases that can arise from COVID. So I'm going to leave that, because I think, and we've got a video up there if people are interested, by Professor Sonaraja, sort of among others, discussing the implications of this. So I'm going to leave that to the experts to talk about. In terms of the questions to me, specifically with regards to, I think there was a question from Ruby, which asked about distributive public finance. I mean, what I mean about that is really, I think how we look at financial resources flowing from multilaterals and from bilaterals to developing countries in the form of aid and philanthropy. We view it in a very charitable perspective, and I think that's problematic, and I think that sort of concentrates you know, power in certain actors unnecessarily. And I think because we're so used to the idea of resourcing and being aid rather than just redistribution of and reparations, in fact, for harm. So if we look at, you know, the flow transfer of resources, we're looking at, you know, extraction, but we're not looking at, you know, a tax, for example, looking at public finance as a tax that need to be, you know, for redistributive means. So, you know, climate finance is viewed more, you know, as charitable transfer to the South rather than a form of financial transfer to the South for, you know, resources extracted from the South for pollution that have been created in the industrialized North, you know, and then, you know, climate finance being that. So that's what I mean by redistributive public finance. And I think yes, we need to think of a way. I think debt restructuring is a mechanism for thinking about that, as, you know, I mean, you know, debt is a form of wealth transfer from the debtor to the creditor. So when you have a formal way of you know, restructuring that debt or relieving that debt on the basis that something else has happened and the debtor can't pay, and actually has the debtor paid enough of, you know, that debt, then, you know, we're talking about a more distributive way of organizing financial relationships between debtor and creditor. And I think that's what I mean by distributive justice. In terms of Argentina, again, that kind of in the tax, I think Mariana asked a question in it. Please comment on the newly installed Argentinian tax over wealth tax to create to fund COVID-19 vaccines. I don't know much about that text, but I would speculate that it's got something to do with the state having resources to fund the purchase of vaccines. And I think that's domestically that makes sense. But I want you to think about what Rachel's talked about in terms of corporate power and vaccines, because again, Argentina is a emerging market caught in a global system of transnational drug production. So there is that issue about access to medicines. You could do that in terms of a domestic structure, but I think Argentina, like many middle-income countries, are caught in a situation where they're not able to access the concessional facilities that will allow them to purchase vaccines from pharmaceutical companies at a reasonable rate, or have aid money or concessional finance to be able to access those vaccines, but not having the sufficient resources that the more industrialized countries would have in terms of actually having the purchasing power. So many middle-income countries, Argentina, Malaysia, are caught in this situation, and it's much more acute because there is a very great reluctance on the part of the states where they are host to the big pharmaceutical companies, are reluctant to allow for the flexibilities that exist within the global trade regime, within the World Trade Organization, within the TRIPS agreement, to allow for generic an exemption to the IP stringent IP legislation, to be able to allow for compulsory licensing, to allow for generic production of drugs within countries, and for those drugs to be manufactured by developing countries and then sold on. And I think that is a broader question. It's not about commenting on whether developing countries should tax the wealthy within that country in order to fund the purchase of vaccines. I think we need to ask the bigger question of whether these countries within a global order have access to affordable medicines in the first place. And I think there was a question also on, but it was an incomplete question on from Argentina, yes, from Daniel.
Thank you. So I think we'll have to wrap it up there, unfortunately. And certainly, given what we've discussed today, it would be great if we could get comments on email to Deborah on future webinars. We've really just started the ball rolling here, and it's been really exciting to hear all the comments and the answers. So I'm going to hand over now to Deborah in a second, who will talk to us about the upcoming events that we are planning. And after that, Deborah will send it back to me to wrap up and to thank everybody. So to you now, Deborah. You're muted, Deborah.
Pardon, sorry about that. Thank you very much, Joanna. My name is Deborah Casalin. I am the editor at the LDRN website, lawdev.org. And first of all, from the network side, I want to say a huge thank you to everybody who's joined us today in this age of almost daily webinars. I especially want to thank our 4 speakers for their excellent interventions. We're really privileged to have all of you engaging with the network, some from the very beginning, and we hope you will join us all again soon, personally or virtually. And I also want to say a special thank you to our hosts and partners, Nelson Mandela University, to Joanna and her team for everything they've done to put together this very exciting webinar today. So with the thanks said from our side, I'd like to just give you all a preview of some of the coming events from the Law and Development Research Network, which will be facilitated by various partners. So just to give you a taste of what's coming up, I think in January we will be launching the Law and Development Encyclopedia, edited by a number of our members and to which many of you, I'm sure, have contributed as well. That will be followed by an early career researchers event, also early next year, hosted by Universidad Austral in Argentina. And of course, our 2021 conference, hosted once again by Nelson Mandela University, at which hopefully we will see many of you as well. So those are our coming events. If you would like to stay up to date, please visit our website at lawdev.org, which I will put the address into the chat now. And there at
Done it, Deborah, so you're okay there.
Pardon. Has it gone into the chat? In any case, there you can keep track of our coming events. You can join our mailing list so that you receive notifications. And also for those who would like to engage even further with the network and our activities, you are also welcome to send in your membership as well. Thank you very much, and I will transfer back to Joanna now.
Thank you very much, Deborah. I'm sitting typing as it comes back to me, and Deborah has extended many thanks. Thank you very much for doing that as well, Deborah, and thank you to you for all the communications that went out. She's worked really hard, and she always does. I see that a number of other posts have also gone into the chat. I'm very aware that we're not that good at time in the South, but I think we've shown that we are today. So I'm going to wrap up with just a few thanks. Firstly, to our speakers, Rachel, Monica, Celine, and Stelina, together with Deborah. It was really fantastic to be able to get to know you better through the planning and the emails and your insights. I think so many people have learned so much, and so many research agendas that we can think about. What should we be doing in our LLM programs? What should our LLD students be researching? How do we work with NGOs, etc.? So thank you, and I really hope that we can continue this conversation. And in fact, announce in one of our upcoming events that there will be another substantive webinar, not only dealing with early career research and launches, but also to deal with the research issues that we need to deal with. So thank you. To the LDRN team, Deborah, thank you very much. And to everybody at the University of Antwerp and Warwick and on the steering committee who gets involved, it's much appreciated. And then to my Nelson Mandela University team, Tom, you've been an absolute star. I think everyone's clapping in the background there. We're going to clap for you, because without Tom, we wouldn't have done this. We've learned how to use Teams. We're an all-lady team, and Tom has been so gracious with all of us. So thank you. He's been a star. If he were here, I would give him flowers. And also to Charmaine Bokus in communications, who's done a lot of the work in the background. Charmaine, you're an absolute star. Tanya Wagner did the invitation for me because I'm useless at that type of stuff. And to the entire faculty of law at Nelson Mandela University, thank you. We really hope to see you all soon at future events. Thank you. I see I'm publishing your comment. Nice to see you there, Giuseppe. And from me and from everybody else, it's a goodbye. If I've missed out a thanks, I'm sorry. Bye-bye, everybody. Cheers. We look forward to a new event.